And welcome everyone. Great. Welcome everyone. And my name is Tim Grant. I'm your host for this evening's webinar. In the background is Matt Hoffman, who you'll be hearing from a little later. You can see on screen our guest speaker, Eric Kamphof, who I will also introduce in a few minutes. But first of all, let me just say you're in for a real treat. We've got three really interesting short videos, sort of introductory videos at the outset, and then I'll introduce Eric, and he's got a first-class presentation for us that I hope you'll appreciate as much as I did when we did a practice session just yesterday. So Matt, if you can play our first video.
This is my preferred way of getting around town. I can go much faster than the traffic typically, and I get a bit of a workout and it's a lot more fun. I can go up to 60 kilometers on a charge, so that takes me a week or a month, depending on how much running I'm doing. I really don't like working up a sweat, especially in the heat of the summer, so I can dial in the level of assistance that I want to avoid that. And basically erase hills, erase headwinds, and I can go everywhere from the lightest setting, which more or less erases the weight of the bike, right through to turbo setting, which feels like being on a tandem with an Olympic cyclist on the back. And so that really suits me just fine. And I love this, I highly recommend it. I have a trailer that I can pull to bring home larger items or lots of groceries or fill up at the farmer's market. And it's just a fabulous way to get around. Thank you.
Question: would you build a website for a major brand with more than 200 million users using Wix?
I'm standing here with Dan, host behind him for the last couple of years, maybe.
Year and a bit.
Yep, and I was very impressed by the bike that's standing in front of him that he's been using on the right through the winter and most months, anyways. And I've just invited him to tell us a little bit about his bike and the many uses that he makes of it.
Sure. So I do residential renovation, so it's handy to have a bike because it's much easier to park, and all of our projects are downtown, so it's usually an easy way to get there. So this bike is it's a Turn HSD, and the model is a S8i, which basically just means it's got a belt drive and it has an internal hub. Both are super low maintenance, which is part of the reason why I picked it. The other reason I like this bike is the handlebars and the seat are adjustable up and down a long way. My partner's 5'6", I'm 6'2", and we have a friend who's about 5 feet, and she looks after our son, who's 3, a lot, and all three of us can ride this bike easily. Obviously, I can carry a lot of stuff, including my son. I usually have like a pizza tray style rack on the front. Occasionally I have to take my trailer, which is how I bring tools and stuff with me. I have just, general venues in the back, and all of them fit great. And the motor is super helpful, especially when you got a heavy load or a headwind or you've had a long day. And what else? I probably get. It's hard to gauge the kilometers of range. I think it's probably 70 if it's on the lowest kind of help setting, and that's usually what it's on.
Does that mean you take the battery out every couple of days and charge it, or?
Yeah, usually a couple of days. Yeah, in the winter, I try to take the battery every day, overnight.
Okay.
Just because it works better, but I just know it's not charging.
Great.
Yeah, every couple of days.
Good.
What else? In the winter, I swapped these tires out for some studded ones. Jury's still out on whether that's great or not. Usually, if there's snow in the bike lane, the studded tires don't help a lot. I don't know.
Okay.
I've only done that for 1 year, so
Good.
we'll see what I might do this year.
Dan, thank you very much. This is great. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
It's just, yes, it does.
Hi, I'm Robin, the founder of Happy Feet Bike Rentals and Toronto. Happy Feet offers electric, cargo, and family bike rentals all year round so that people can try out different kinds of bikes to see if they're a good fit for their lifestyle. I have bikes ranging from the electric Brompton folding bike through various sizes of long tail bikes up to the front-loading Bullet and even a 3-wheeled trike for big families or heavy rides. You can rent from Happy Feet by the day or by the week, and I deliver the bike to you and pick up from you again at the end of the rental. All accessories, including racks, bags, child food, and lots of cars, are included in the rental price. And I'm happy to chat anytime to help you figure out the best bike to suit your requirements. You can find me online at happyfeets.ca. That's happy, FIETS.ca, or follow me on social media to see what kinds of adventures I get to. Thanks.
And thanks again to Matt Hoffman in the background, whose picture you're seeing in front of the Christmas tree, or the illuminated lit Christmas tree. And thanks to those who helped us with those videos. For those who've just joined in the last few moments, we just saw the third of 3 videos. We are recording this session, so if you missed them, we will be sharing a link with all participants of the recording when it's posted on our website so that you can share with your friends. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce you to Eric Kamphof. Eric has been for 20 years actually the manager of Curbside Cycles up on Bloor Street between Spadina and Bathurst. And there's really no one that I know of who knows more about e-bikes. And in fact, not only does Eric sell them at the retail level, but he also wholesales e-bikes to other shops. And indeed, I think in one of my first conversations with him, he was very actively working with the Ministry of Transportation to try to help them come up with decent regulations and even decent definitions about e-bikes, which they were struggling with at the time. So it's a great pleasure, Eric. To everyone else, as I mentioned at the outset, we did a practice session. He's got a great presentation. You're in for a treat. Eric, over to you.
Thanks, Tim. I suppose you need me to share my screen. Is that right?
We do.
All right. It shall be so. And is that working? Oh, is that working now?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Well, thanks. Thanks, Tim, for the introduction. Nice to be reminded that I've been at Curbside for 20 years. But my name is Eric Kamphof, and I am the general manager of Curbside Cycle. And anyone who knows a little bit about Curbside Cycles knows that we've always been a store focused on urban transportation. And this may seem strange, but this actually sets us apart from the very industry we work in, because most bike stores are focused on cycling either as recreation or performance sport. Thus, to supply many of the products we sell, we actually have to import them ourselves, usually from Germany, Denmark, and especially, of course, Holland. And in the case of e-bikes, of course, that means importing bikes that are globally serviceable, so that if we sell one to a store across the country, the mechanic can repair it quickly and easily. And so this issue is going to come up as we go on. But before we jump into the topic of e-bikes, it's good to frame the question: why cycling works as transportation in the first place. And perhaps one of the great changes in North America lately has been the return to living downtown. So I grew up in the suburbs of Vancouver, so it's intoxicating to see people riding bikes downtown. And 20 years ago, for instance, a value marker like a walk score, which you'll be familiar with if you're buying real estate, would have meant very little to a consumer who was only happy to drive distances between homework and errands and play. But today, a higher walk score can be the single difference between two property values. The higher the walk score, the higher the price. And this example of walk scores helps us understand how proximity has become a critical value to a renter or homeowner today. And this word proximity in this case generally means some sort of radius activity that lies between work, home, errands, and play, which are basically the sum of people's transportation journeys. Now, we all know that in Holland, many people ride bikes, but what we may not realize is what radius people actually ride these bikes. And the cool thing about Holland is that they take great pains to research their transportation habits, and they publish them too. And what the research reveals is that most people in Holland don't cycle for all trips. They actually only cycle generally for trips that are under 7.5 kilometers. And this 7.5 kilometer range is a good marker for the value that both walk scores or these last mile concepts are trying to address. It's basically a range of activity that is too close to drive and too far to walk. So again, too close to drive, too far to walk. Anybody who lives downtown knows this very well. And as the Dutch know very well, that's where the bicycle does its best work. Now, this slide is taken from a Netherlands government study. And here you can see that cycling holds the large majority of trips in distances under 7.5 kilometers. So that's that first column. And while distances in this radius are determined to be too far to walk or too close to drive, we still see high numbers of people walking or driving. But cycling has each individually beat. And now note in column 2 that the moment that distances exceed 7.5 kilometers, you can instantly see the car take over. So, you know, the Dutch aren't perfect. And this is probably true for you as well. If you're a Toronto cyclist, you might take the car out if you have a car for longer distances. But it is precisely for distances over 7.5 kilometers that the concept of an e-bike should be introduced. So in Holland, they're starting to see e-bikes start to chip away at that second column there, those distances between 7.5 and 15 kilometers. And that's the exciting stuff. Now, the numbers show that an e-bike simply works better than a car in distances up to 15 kilometers. A recent study done by the German Federal Environment Agency showed that while a regular bike is already faster than a car in urban distances up to 5 kilometers, an e-bike is faster than a car in urban or suburban distances up to and exceeding 12 kilometers. So the e-bike has the numbers on its side. Now it's just a matter of this new technology competing with the car by gathering more and more users. So while many enjoy an e-bike as a fun recreational tool, we at Curbside believe it has the potential to revolutionize the way we transport ourselves. And that could mean downtown or in the suburbs. So an e-bike has the same humility as a bicycle, but it doesn't have the same limits. It truly gives automobiles a run for their money, especially if you start running the math on the range of most of your current existing car trips. So in Holland, we're starting to see suburban locations or bedroom communities usually serviced by car or by train, now being serviced by e-bike. And that could mean profound things for here in Toronto, here in Ontario, here in Canada. If you live in distances under 7.5 kilometers, an e-bike can just flatten hills and guarantee you always arrive sweat-free. It was cool to see the one of the videos mentioned that. And in distances over 7.5 kilometers, you still can arrive sweat-free, flatten any hill, but accomplish the kind of range that a car would usually be able to do. And of course, unlike a car, you can move way more efficiently on an e-bike, all the while adding a huge boost to your health and a huge impact on your financial health as well. So to provide some context, let's see what kind of distances an e-bike can accomplish daily from the Curbside store in the annex. Little shameless plug there. Already you can see how a bike is a profound technology when compared with walking. As a cyclist, for instance, you could easily ride to High Park or Leslieville on a regular bike. But then, of course, the question we always get is, what about that big hill that goes from, you know, Front Street all the way up to Lawrence and more? This sort of north-south trajectory. Here, an e-bike solves that problem for distances under 7.5 kilometers. Suddenly, though, distances from the 401 and south become easily bikeable. But in the case of an e-bike, it wouldn't just be able to take you that far. It could go deep into Vaughan or even Richmond Hill, cutting through gridlock and making your life much better. And to really validate just how an e-bike can change your transportation habits, considering that according to the US Office of Energy, most car trips are just under 5 kilometers. It's just staggering. And already that's something a regular bike can cover, but an e-bike can stretch that distance even more. And if you remember that magic 7.5 kilometer number that I've been throwing out, note that the average commute for Metro Toronto is just 7.5 kilometers. That means an e-bike takes what a regular bike can do and does it better than a car or transit at the same time. And I need to make one quick little note because I can feel a question coming on later. But while the range of 7.5 kilometers to 15 kilometers, so that second column in the slide before, is where we hope e-bikes to do their big work, it should be noted that most e-bikes have a daily range anywhere between 50 to 150 kilometers. It's pretty amazing. And you can double that just by getting to work, charging your battery, which only takes 3.5 hours. So that means that an e-bike could conceivably handle commutes as far as Oakville. And some people actually do that. Now, what is an e-bike? Well, that is a terrific question. And Tim, you mentioned that I've worked with the MTO on this, and it's still a very live question. So ultimately, the question will come down to regulation. And regulation is there, of course, to make traffic and bicycle infrastructure safe. Now, this is a critical point because bicycle infrastructure is there to keep cyclists safe from automobiles. But if bicycle infrastructure itself allows for a wide diversity of vehicles, then safety is threatened within the bike lane by crowding, collisions, and like general chaos. And this is exactly the state of our bike lanes today. And I hate to sound negative, but I hope many people are nodding their head. So in many ways, both bike lanes and e-bikes are new technologies for North America. So we need to be patient. And there is a lack of uniformity in physical infrastructure and regulative infrastructure, and finally, what some people call behavioral infrastructure. And by that, I mean, in Holland, for instance, you couldn't just stop in the bike lane and go on your cell phone. You'd be thrown out. But you can do that here. There's sort of just like a decorum that hasn't quite habituated quite yet. And again, these things take time. So now as a participant and observer to North Americans' rapidly changing transportation habits, I can only observe that we are in the Wild West. And that means the Wild West of infrastructure. It means the Wild West of regulations. And in my own industry, the Wild West of the e-bikes themselves. And now the good news is that we're slowly starting to see some mature positions evolve. This is especially true in my industry, which I'll get back to later. And of course, all this takes time and I suppose mistakes. But the important thing is that it doesn't cause injury or perhaps even death. And that's why regulations and safe e-bikes are critical. Now, as Tim mentioned, I do some consulting work with the Ministry of Transportation, so hereafter the MTO, to save the syllables, alongside the Pembina Institute as well. And the best single definition we have found for bikes is that produced by the People for Bikes, which is a US-based advocacy organization. That's what you're seeing on the screen right now. So we have Class 1 bikes, and this is also known as a pedelic. This is the kind of bike you will see in most mainstream bicycle stores. And I like to call this bike a bionic bike because it's truly amazing. It will not release power unless you are feeding it power. So it will constantly, it will not, you have to pedal the bike in order for the bike to respond. And if you pedal harder, you'll get more power. And it's basically interpreting data. So it's constantly tuning data to the outputs that you, the rider, are feeding into the system. And I can get more into that if you want later, but that's what I mean by bionic. So it takes rider feedback and translates this into a variable power output. Now, the important thing to remember here, as we talk with the other bikes, is that the motor and pedaling are intimately connected. So one only works with the other. From a safety point of view, that means electric power to the pedals is regulated by the inputs of the rider. So if you're going up a major hill, the motor will find its peak power and it'll deliver that to you. But you cannot access this peak power just whenever you want. There is no throttle. You need to be in the right state of affairs with the right data inputs for this power to actuate. And this is the only kind of bike, I should say, that is permitted in the European Union. And it's probably the best definition of a true e-bike because it requires pedaling and does not permit any other form of autonomous power. Okay, on to Class 2 bikes. These are the bikes you would see a lot of food delivery riders using here in Toronto. And while they might have the same pedalic motor as a Class 1, they also have a throttle. And that lets the motor operate autonomously at pedaling. So you don't need to pedal at all. Now, these bikes are generally illegal in most of Europe since an autonomous motor immediately lumps it into the motor vehicle category. From a safety standpoint, the rider can access the motor's peak power at the press of a button or the slip of a button. To many, this bike is dangerous, especially because the continuous output power, which is a technical term, allowed in North America is actually double that in Europe. So it puts a lot of torque at the rider's fingertips. And if this bike is really heavy, as they often are, this would threaten greater injury in the event of a collision. And it is for this liability reason that mainstream motor providers like Bosch, Shimano, and Yamaha do not make Class 2 e-bikes. And it is also for this reason that you generally won't find Class 2 e-bikes at mainstream bike stores, partly because of safety, partly because of quality, and partly because of substandard after-sales service, which we'll get to later. Instead, they're largely sold online and direct to consumer, which in our experience has been a real buyer beware scenario. And finally, their Class 3, or what we call speed pedelecs, which cannot be sold in Canada because the current speed for all e-bikes Canada-wide right now, at least, is 32 kilometers per hour. Now, if these are to be made legal in Canada, it would be because the federal government has just recently offloaded all e-bike regulations to the provinces, meaning it is not unlikely that we'll see a lack of uniformity across Canada in e-bike regulations. And this is why the People for Bikes proposal, which you're seeing on the screen again, exists. It's there to help legislators across North America adopt sensible and uniform policies. And in the United States right now, already 36 states have adopted this proposal, the People for Bikes proposal, and that number continues to grow every year. Now let's look at what's happening here in Ontario. Now, just by way of context, the reason that good definitions for an e-bike matter is because these regulations determine in the very first instance what is illegal or what is legal. And so again, I'll mention that in Europe, all Class 2, which again is a throttle assist e-bike, are not permitted. But let's say they are permitted. It still helps to determine different kinds of classes of bikes. That way you can sort of determine which bike is allowed in which particular bike lane, what perhaps requires a helmet, or what even requires license and registration. So working with the Pembina Institute, our e-bike working group has actually tried to get the MTO to adopt the People for Bikes definitions in their last round of legislation just actually about a year ago, and it was not accepted. Now, if there is a reason for the current plurality of e-bikes, and what some might call motor vehicles in your Toronto bike lanes, it's because the MTO has not properly clarified the difference between a throttle-assisted bicycle and an e-moped. What these two bikes have in common is the fact that they're throttle-assisted and the presence of pedals. The only difference is cosmetic. And the strange thing the MTO has done is to just distinguish Class 2 throttle-assisted e-bikes from mopeds by nothing more than cosmetic distinctions, arguing that a throttle-assisted Class 2 e-bicycle must look like a bicycle. That is, it must have a, quote, an exposed frame and fork, whereas a Class 2 e-moped must look like a moped. Now, these definitions blur the line between Class 1 pedelecs, which again are pedal assist, the European ones, and they have those highly regulated computer controlled power outputs, and it confuses that between Class 2 throttle assisted bikes. After all, both have exposed frames and forks, but in the case of Class 2, you can just access the full peak power of these motors at the twist of a throttle. And this becomes more and more concerning the heavier the bike gets. So for instance, with a cargo bike, which generally weighs about 100 pounds, this is the kind of bike you would not want to be in a collision with. And that's why in the EU, the European Union, it has highly regulated Class 1 motors that would regulate power. But in Toronto, you could legally ride 120 kilograms, so it's close to 300 pounds, Class 2, so throttle assist bike, which would have about the same torque found as a small automobile. And they would be treated as the same bike simply because they both have the same exposed frame and fork. So all of this creates two problems. The first is that too many kinds of bicycles and motor vehicles are present in the bike lane, some which are far more dangerous than others. And second, it is nearly impossible for the police to tease out these definitions and to enforce these definitions. To fire up your imagination of what good legislation could look like, we might consider California, who did adopt the People for Bikes regulations and then added a fourth category for mopeds. And here you can see some smart definitions being made. For instance, a Class 2 throttle assist bike is actually not considered pedal operated because it has an autonomous motor, but it's still permitted in all the regular bicycle infrastructure. So perhaps you might disagree. Maybe it needs to be in different kinds of bike lanes and not in others, but the mere definition allows you to tweak those things later on. The law can be revised. In Ontario presently, this bike is blurred with both an e-moped and a class 1 computer-assisted pedelec. And in fact, it's because of these good definitions that California is one of the only states that permit these class 3 super speedy bikes that I mentioned just earlier. And these are bikes that are in fact purely pedal assist, so just like a class 1 assist, so there's no throttle, but it can achieve speeds up to 45 kilometers per hour. But because this bike is given a special distinction, we can note that in California, they've put limits on where this bike can ride. So again, these classifications help. So in California, you could only really put these bikes into bike lanes and not recreational bike paths. And perhaps the best thing about California, and this is my opinion, is that the e-mopeds actually are classified in a separate category, and they do require a driver's license to operate. And moreover, they're not permitted in separated bike lanes nor recreational bike paths. So I don't think California has it perfect, but their definitions are solid, and that allows for tweaking and especially real-time enforcement. So I mentioned that if legislation is the Wild West, well, so are the bikes themselves. And thankfully, this is beginning to change for a mature and uniform position. Now, this mature and uniform position can be traced as an evolution that has to do with where the e-bike motor is placed. And it's taken quite a while to answer this question. Where does the motor go on an e-bike? And it's been cool to watch the development of this answer come with more and more major players or more recognized brands who are entering the market as this question is being answered. So I'll explain. So the first generation of e-bikes, which was, like 15 years ago, they all used front hub drive motors. And these motors were all class 2. So once again, throttle assist, and they're all retrofit kits that you could attach to most any bicycle. However, they weren't particularly safe. If you think about the front wheel of the bike as the steering wheel and the rear wheel as the acceleration wheel, it makes far more sense to put the motor where the acceleration occurs, not where the handling occurs. So for instance, if the motor were to, the rider, were to hit the throttle in a slippery steering situation, the entire bike could slide out. And we've had stories of cargo bikes doing that in these early stages of the e-bike. So thus, it didn't take long for the front wheel motor to be replaced by the rear wheel motor. And like front wheel motors, rear wheel motors, when they entered the market, were also class 2 throttle assist. There were also aftermarket kits that you could install onto pretty much any bike. And now the largest maker of rear drive motors was Bionics, and this was a Canadian-made motor manufactured by Magna International. It was on the TSX, and it felt too big to fail. And whereas the front wheel motor saw no true industry leaders, there's just lots and lots of brands and lots of turnovers and bankruptcies, and it was hard to carry because you just felt like tomorrow the company you committed to is going to go out of business. Well, Bionics was the first company in a field of competitors to really establish true global serviceability. And that meant good mechanic training for us. And it meant good access to technical support in case we really were stumped. And most of all, good access to parts so we could fix that bike and get you back out riding. And it did seem for years that Bionics was too big to fail until it finally did. And they filed, I think, for bankruptcy about 5 years ago. And the terrible thing is that it left a lot of customers, even to this day, still stranded with systems that have no support. And it made bike stores like ours very wary about the vast array of other companies selling similar systems without that sort of stable support. And then came the mid-drive system. And it is without a doubt that the mid-drive system is what drove companies like Bionics to bankruptcy, which is a shame. But mid-drive systems marked the end of aftermarket kits. And it marked the beginning of true ground-up, purpose-built e-bikes. So why a mid-drive? Well, if you think about it, a true electric assist is called a pedal assist, or what we've noted as a pedelec. So why not locate the motor right there in the center of pedaling? After all, that's how the motor activates, is through this active pedaling. And that's exactly what a mid-drive electric assist does. It situates the motor right at the center of the crankset rather than the hub of either the front or rear wheel. And now when mid-drives first came out, we noticed 3 things almost right away. So first, the system was no longer a kit. Instead, the frame of the bike had to be engineered around the motor. And again, this marked the first time a purpose-built e-bike was sold to the consumer. And it created a chasm between regular bikes sold with kits and then these purpose-built e-bikes. And by purpose-built, I mean strong brakes, parts that are on the bike that can't rattle loose due to the higher vibration, tougher tires with more rubber, like pretty much everything. Second, the players in this market were even bigger than Bionics. So in a market that was once populated by all sorts of Kickstarters and Chinese off-brand motors, we began to see blue chip players like Bosch, Shimano, Yamaha enter the market. And these are companies that promise the highest level of research and design, quality control, mechanic training, and global after-sales service. And finally, all of these motors were class 1 pedalic, so no throttle. And they had sophisticated computer systems that more and more work to integrate riders' inputs into that variable output. So doing that job of interpreting your data into like the power you need. And if you ride in these systems, the only metaphor I have is that it just feels like it's reading your mind. It's quite sensational. And to really observe how there's a maturity developing in the e-bike market, you might want to look at what is available online today to what is actually available at a mainstream bike store. So a search on the internet today reveals thousands of class 1 pedalics and all sorts of class 2 throttle assists. But if you go to an actual bike store, this will show a very different reality. And most bike stores in Canada now, after all of this, only carry brand name class 1 pedalic e-assists. In fact, you could probably observe that the market is now divided between the brand name class 1 motors that you'll see sold at stores like ours, and then the class 2 sort of throttle assists, which are almost exclusively sold direct to consumer or online. And we have nothing against online bicycle sales because we do that ourselves. But the problem with many direct to consumer class 2 throttles is that someone has to fix these bikes when something goes wrong. So even if companies are cleverly bypassing bike stores to sell direct to consumer, we still are the ones who have to provide the after sales service. And the problem today is that most bike stores like our own won't fix these systems because we simply can't get the parts, the quality support, and the whole thing becomes lagging and very, very long. And we become the ones responsible for that. So even though we bring bikes as far away as Europe into North America, we ensure that even these are still globally serviceable across the continent. Well, now to the bikes themselves. So at Curbside, we are once again a transportation store, and we carry 3 kinds of bikes designed for transportation. So the first is a cargo bike, which is a pretty revolutionary bicycle used for both delivery in the case of brands like FedEx, which we sold 60 cargo bikes to recently, and also for families. So this would always be a class 1. So again, computer assisted mid-drive motor, and it'll have a range of 60 to 80 kilometers. And despite its heavier weight, this class 1 motor will ensure that the safe power regulation keeps you safe, your precious cargo safe, and of course, the other cyclists you share the bike lane with safe. And these cargo bikes tend to be from Holland, Germany, or Denmark, very mature cycling cultures. And they all use boxes that are designed to be highly impact resistant. So they smash cars into these at 40 kilometers per hour, and your precious cargo would be safe. Now, the second kind of bike we sell is just a regular e-bike. And it was cool to watch the fellow, Tim, that you shot with the turn bike, because he mentioned some of these features, because our e-bikes are a little bit different from other e-bikes you might see at other stores. And it's while they'll share, the class 1 mid-drive, which is what your partner had in the video there as well, the parts will be engineered more for transportation rather than recreation. So that means that you'll see technologies like internal gear hubs, rather than higher maintenance derailleur system. So basically everything's inside, under the trunk, so to speak, rather than being totally exposed. And you'll also use perhaps belt drives instead of chains, which gives you way more longevity. And some even more sophisticated systems might include electronic shifting, which if you are a winter cyclist, which that person was, this will eliminate the problem of cables freezing up in the winter, which is a huge problem. And these bikes will also tend to use an upright seating position so that you're more visible from behind, but you also have more visibility ahead. And the third kind of bike is an electric folding bike. And this is one bike that so far has not been able to benefit from class 1 mid-drive technology. And the reason for that is that most mid-drive motor companies like Bosch, Shimano, and Yamaha are just obsessed right now with building bigger and better motors. And that's because they're thinking of the freight sector, like companies like FedEx that want to use these bikes for deliveries. They're not thinking of lightweight folding bikes, which actually need to be lifted on a regular basis, whether into your house or onto the GO train. So these folding bikes are in fact quite different from regular bikes, and they kind of require their own motor. And you could use kits, but the problem with kits is that they don't always integrate well into the folded size, and you're kind of just stuck having to do on your own. So folding bikes are one of those areas where we actually break our own rules. The Brompton in this case that you're looking at, this folding bike has a front drive motor, and to Brompton's credit, it was designed in conjunction with Williams Formula One. So if anybody watches Formula One, you're going gaga. So they did their homework, and the very first thing they did, to their credit, is the minute they launched the motor, they made sure that there was global mechanic training, so that every single Brompton store could service this bike. And that is still different though from the other two bikes that you saw, where pretty much, not pretty much, every bike store in North America could service those other two bikes. Yeah, so hey, that sums it up, and I hope that I have shown the real opportunity for e-bikes. Of course, I'm aware that I've also shown some of the work that needs to be done. But I believe, yeah, that an e-bike has the ability to make really profound impacts on the way we transport ourselves. And I really think of the e-bike as a transformational object, and not just for the city core, but as a replacement for the large majority of urban or suburban trips. And an e-bike can potentially replace, for many, a second or third car. And it's going to dramatically improve your health no matter what. It's certainly going to improve your financial circumstances. And we also really need to care about our CO2 reduction. And as I hope to have indicated, this is all going to take some time to mature. This is a new technology. So even in Holland, we're only starting to see e-bikes begin to chip away at distances, over 7.5 kilometers. But really, I invite you to ride one, come by for a test ride, because I can't really describe like how I'm always trying to search for the adjective on like how an e-bike feels. On one hand, it's like very recognizable because you're like, this is a bike. And on the other hand, it feels very unrecognizable, but like in a really great way. On one of these class 1 bikes, at least, you would realize immediately why a throttle wouldn't even be necessary, because you can sense that computer system just doing its job. When you go up a hill, it matches it gives you what you need. And when you peak at the top, the power sort of fades back into the background. It's just sort of doing it all. And you have this really profound sense of range. Like you can just suddenly go long distances, more than you could on your regular bike. And that hills are actually something you want to look for because they're fun to climb on an e-bike. And so it opens up the world, and it becomes like almost like intoxicating to realize that you could ride your bike instead of drive, that you're on some sort of best kept secret. But this is a machine that like really reduces the stress of gridlock. You just breeze by traffic. It keeps you healthy and happy, and it saves you like tons of money. And Eric, so of course, last paragraph.
Yeah, you did really well. This was an incredibly packed presentation, and a very rich one, and I'm very appreciative of that, as no doubt others are. Matt Hoffman, who's going to pose the questions to you, working in the background, is put the note in the chat, and I hope everyone will open up the chat box. And his note was, of course, put your questions in the chat box, and Matt is going to relay them to you, and I've got a couple of questions as well. So Matt, over to you. Do you want to pick up on any of the ones that are there now?
Yep. First one is about theft. Do you find that e-bikes are theft magnets? Can they be left somewhere? How are they usually locked up?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. So, I mean, we sell hundreds of e-bikes, and we sell these huge cargo bikes, which you can't take inside. And so that question comes up all the time. It's really good to, I mean, like, it's going to sound flaky, but like in the art of war, it's good to know who your enemy is. And 90% of all street level theft it's been proven, especially in Holland, tied to, unfortunately, street level drugs. And there is no such thing as a theft magnet per se. Most of the time, bikes are being stolen just for quick turnaround. When you have sophisticated professional bike rings, it's much more of a break and enter, according to the evidence we've heard from police, and especially from customers who come in and share their stories. And these are often more organized rings that will sort of steal a high-end, racing bike and sell it in Montreal, Facebook Marketplace, or Ottawa. So we always tell people there's lots of preventative things you can do to make sure your bike doesn't get stolen. And once again, we sell hundreds of e-bikes, and they're parked on the street and they don't get stolen. One is like a $300 lock. That's gonna give the thief one hell of a time to bust through. Like, we're talking 30 minutes, sparks flying up in the air, a ton of noise. 2 is an alarm system, so that it just basically, if the bike gets bumped in the act of theft, it just emits a warning signal to the thief that says, hey, maybe you don't want to continue. And if you do, it's gonna create a piercing sound. And three, nowadays you can get these GPS things or these Apple AirTags that really are amazing. If the bike gets stolen, you could literally watch it move and call the police and say, hey, my bike right now is at Bathurst and so-and-so, please intervene. It looks like this. So yeah, I mean, great question, but there are answers. I'm not saying that this is 100%, nothing is, but it works. It feels like 97% of the time.
Okay, and people are looking for a little more information about charging. Do all e-bikes have removable batteries? Do they charge on a regular plug?
Yeah, they absolutely do. Yeah, so e-bike batteries are really easy to remove from the bike. I mean, you actually don't have to remove the battery on a lot of these bikes. You can just charge it on a bike. But if you want to remove the battery, there's a key, because of course these batteries are worth a lot of money. So it too is locked onto the bike. So you simply just turn the key, pop the battery off, plug it into a regular wall socket, and in 3.5 hours, you've got a full charge. Or at 2 hours, you've got an 80% charge, and you can charge it whenever you want. You can, it's not like the old days where you had to like charge it all the way, the battery would develop a memory. These are smart batteries, and you can sort of just charge it willy-nilly.
Great. What about weight? How heavy what's the sort of range of weight on e-bikes?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. So it really depends. So if you're looking for like a lightweight folding e-bike, you're usually looking around 35 to 40 pounds. By way of example, though, a typical bike that we would sell at the store, which has fenders, a rack, kickstand, bell, that kind of stuff, the average weight is about 30, 32 pounds. So that's not that much more. The bigger, basically the rule is the more range you want and the more power you want, that's what increases the weight. So if you're just a city cyclist who says, hey, I'm not using this bike for massive, overnight adventures, which some people do. I'm just going back and forth to work. Thank you very much. The bike then is maybe 45 pounds tops. If you want to do, overnight adventures, I've met someone who was riding around the world on one when I was in Germany over the summer, and that bike was super heavy. It had, I think, three 1,000 watt batteries on it, and each of those things were quite heavy. So let's say 45 pounds and up.
Okay, and then I think the question that everybody's on everyone's mind, what are we talking ballpark prices?
Yeah, well, they're not bad. I mean, I'd say they're about 3,700 and up. I mean, these days you can't quote me on anything because bicycles are really hard to get and have been subject to the wildest waves of inflation. But yeah, 3,700 would get you a really darn good e-bike. And that would be one of these class 1 e-bikes that have the pedal assist.
Matt, I'm going to jump in here with another, or sorry, do you want to say more about other prices, Eric?
I was just going to say cheaper than a car.
They are indeed, and you did speak well about the potential of e-bikes really to change, especially for families in the suburbs with 2 cars, 3 cars. Not all of the drivers in that household need to travel long distances, and those traveling short distances, those are the ones that are where e-bikes can really help financially and to replace car trips. My question to you was, and we chatted about this the other day when we were doing our practice session. You alluded already in this presentation to a lot of the online e-bikes that don't have robust systems, and when they fail, it's hard to get parts and so on. There's also a couple of e-bike kits that are on the market where you buy the kit and that allows you to keep riding your conventional bike. Any comments on those?
Yeah, I only know of one, which is called Switch, and yeah, it looks pretty good. My concern with those is always if they do break, you need someone who's going to service it. And I think a lot of people are buying e-bikes right now on price, and they're not always remembering that it needs to come back and get serviced, just like a car would. And a lot of e-bike brands now are sort of entering the marketplace. Like imagine if Nissan came into North America, but had no dealer networks at all, no expert service, no auto shops. They just simply sold online. And that is kind of what's happening. And I like to say that a motor is only as good as its after sales service and its network of dealers that can support it. And I need to say this because what we've seen is the whole e-bike phenomena was created by startups, and it was really exciting. But it was full of problems. I mean, tons and tons of people just left with bikes that no longer could get fixed. So I'm really excited to see Bosch and Shimano and Yamaha enter the market. But I'm not that kind of capitalist. I mean, I want to see these startups really succeed. And right now, we're not seeing that. We're not seeing a startup truly making a better motor than these three big companies, or providing that network after sales service. And I think for sure that's coming. But right now, I would say it's buyer beware. Yeah.
All right, we got a question about longevity. How long do e-bikes last?
Yeah, I mean, it needs the same amount of service as a regular bike. When you bring your bike into our shop, it is a little bit different. You get a yearly tune-up, so we do all the same stuff we normally do in a tune-up, but we would now plug the bike into a desktop, run diagnostics, so that's a little bit of extra work. So long as you're doing that, the bike will last like easily 20 years. If you do those precautions. The real question though, Tim, is the battery. So the battery, of course, has a distinct life. At some point, the battery is going to die. And so for instance, we've been selling e-bikes for 20 years. I don't even think sorry, not 20 years, but 10 years. I think we've replaced maybe 20 batteries or so. Not very many, because they do tend to go very long. So they'll take 4,000 unique charges. So that means if you charge it today 20% and tomorrow 80%, that equals one charge, and you can do 4,000 of those before the battery starts to show its lifespan. So they say on average that's between 5 and 10 years length of battery.
Okay,
depends on your daily riding habits, how far you're going.
And Blake has something in there in the chat about he replaced his battery about 5 years, after 5 years, but the life may have been shortened due to winter storage outside.
Yep, Blake, that's a darn good point. Yep. So even Elon Musk hasn't figured out the problem of extreme heat or extreme cold. So when you are riding your e-bike in the extreme cold, you'll notice that you're losing about 15% of the published range that the heads-up display gives you. And it is a really good idea to either cover that battery up with like a neoprene cover, which you can buy, or bring it in overnight as you're charging it. Yeah, great point.
And then a couple of technical questions. Can you comment on regenerative braking, as I assume as part of battery charging, and also mid-mount chain failure concerns?
Yeah. So those are two really big questions. The regenerative braking was featured actually on the Bionic systems, which I mentioned, and it was super cool. The problem is that nobody used it. To regenerate your system, you would have to basically flick this, press this button, and the motor would suddenly the resistance generated by the motor would be so huge that it felt like you were riding like a spin bike on maximum tension settings. So the idea is that you would regenerate only when you're going downhill. So you climb up this hill using all the e-bike assist that you've got, and then going downhill you turn this on because it's almost like an engine brake, and it would regenerate the power. So it makes your downhill suddenly not all that much fun. And then the question was, how much did it actually cycle back into the system? And it wasn't much. It just wasn't much to make an impact. So it was really cool. I'm sure it can be developed even better. Just no one's doing that right now. When I mentioned like Bosch, Shimano, Yamaha, I don't even think it's on their drawing boards. As for mid-drive chain breakage, yeah, you do get more chains breaking on a mid-drive. I ride a mid-drive myself. I've never had that problem. We don't see too much of it. But yeah, a rear drive system it makes sense, right? Like the mid-drive is pulling the chain right from the center. So it can cause more chain failures. A lot of the bikes we sell have belt drives, which really solves that problem. Belt drives run for 60,000 kilometers before it needs to be replaced, which is pretty impressive compared to a chain, which will maybe run you 5,000 kilometers. So there's cool technologies happening there too. And you got to remember, if your chain breaks, that sucks, but chains are $30. So it's not that catastrophic.
I'll jump in with a question, Matt, if I may. You alluded to this as well in your talk, that that's kind of the chaos in the bike lane, and you made the point that it's with all these new vehicles, including e-scooters and e-mopeds and so forth, that there's it is a kind of wild west in the bike lanes. Any thought of, I think you were referring, of course, to Holland, where this has been, they've kind of wrestled with this. Do you have a sense of advice for the city of Toronto as they, or is it better that it be the MTO, the Ministry of Transportation, to develop province-wide regulations that will help reduce accidents and conflicts within bike lanes?
Yeah, that's such a good question. There's a part of me that really looks at North American, like we're going to develop our own bike culture distinct from Holland. And to me, that's really exciting. And I think one thing that's really cool about North America is the sheer diversity of bikes. Somebody once told me in a trip to Denmark, that's the only reason why bike lanes are safe in Denmark is because everybody rides the exact same bike, which is true. So even that just sort of regulates the speed. But here, that's not the case. Yeah, so it's a challenge. I think you do need to make definitions, though, between these different kinds of bikes. So the very first piece of advice I'd have to the MTO is revisit that people for bikes definition. It really allows you to say, hey, an e-moped is different from, one of these food delivery bikes with a throttle, and maybe that food delivery bike with a throttle should be allowed in a bike lane, but maybe that e-moped shouldn't. And it'll help also make this distinction between e-mopeds that go under 32 kilometers and ones that go over, because that's now a distinction in the MTO guidelines, but I don't know how anybody's going to possibly enforce that. So it's just messy. So start there. And as for the diversity in the bike lanes themselves, maybe it comes to bike lane width. Maybe they just need to be a little bit wider. It's tricky. It's really tricky. For instance, if you looked very carefully at that sheet from the MTO of like what's allowed, what's not allowed, you'll see that those kick scooters aren't allowed. And in many ways, my opinion is those kick scooters are lightweight. As long as they're going 32 kilometers per hour, I think they're really cool. I'd rather have those in the bike lane than a 120 kilogram e-moped that that would really hurt if it ran into you. So tricky. Really tricky. Those are hunches. That's the best I can give you.
There's a comment in the chat about policy related that Toronto Island ferries limit e-bike tire size to 26 inches.
Oh, I didn't really. Then I am breaking the rules all the time. Is that a fact? I did not know that. I wonder why. So the diameter of the wheel. Huh. Yeah, I'm sorry, I can't comment on that. I think that's silly. I can comment that way.
Great. Well, thank you. I think it's this, unless people have more questions, and please type them into the chat ASAP if you do. I do want to just, before thanking Eric, just note that on this last slide, as you've already probably noticed, in the upper left is the Curbside Cycle URL for their website. Happy Feet, we were introduced to by Robin, the owner, who rents cargo bikes. And we didn't mention Zig, which rents standard e-bikes and has shops in Cabbagetown and Parkdale. And I've known of several friends who've rented from Zig and then they've gone to Curbside or Urbane Cyclist when they were convinced that yes, the e-bike was for them, and now they've leased it for a month from Zig, and now they're ready to to buy one themselves. And I'm sure that's Robin's experience at Happy Feet as well. Okay, seeing no more questions, a big thanks to you, Matt, in the background for hosting us. And Eric for a fantastic, I think we're going to get a couple of comments here. Let's hear from Allison. I live on Toronto Island and my neighbors have e-bikes at different tire sizes. The limits on ferries are to non-pedal e-bikes and e-scooters. Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, and probably the moped kind of scooters is what's referred to. Eric, again, thank you for putting all the time in. We did a practice session yesterday. You packed even more information in since then, and I'm hugely appreciative of the time that you took away from your business to serve us. As I mentioned to you yesterday, while our turnout was likely to be low in terms of people attending the webinar, I know that literally hundreds of people are going to watch the recording of this session in the coming months and the next couple of years, and we will be promoting it. And I hope all of those on the webinar tonight will share the link that we send you in a day or two, and or you will find at the Harvard Village on the Net Zero page at harvardvillage.com. So Eric and guests and Matt, a big thank you, and I guess we can hit the record button and close this wonderful session down. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks so much, everybody.